Time now for Behind the Headlines and our regular look at some of the stories in the news today. And we start with the US. Following Joe Biden's victory, world leaders wait to see what the future will hold for US foreign policy. The Financial Times gives us a rundown of who the winners and losers are likely to be. And Biden has made it clear that the US will be rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. France's Le Monde strikes an optimistic tone, saying we now have a chance to avoid the worst effects of climate change. The South China Morning Post reports on China's tightening grip on Hong Kong after pro-democracy lawmakers in the city resigned in protest after Beijing forced out 4 of their colleagues. And finally, as coronavirus cases in the UK continue to rise, iNews reports on the plan to send students home for Christmas without taking COVID with them, hopefully. Joining me to review these stories is Nabila Ramdani and Nigel Nelson. Good to have both of you with us today. So let's start with Joe Biden in the White House. Which world leaders stand to lose out? Nabila, when I think about who might not be so happy, the ones that spring to mind are countries like Israel and Russia.
Well, indeed, but it has to be said that clear foreign policy stances are, of course, hugely important for any new US president. But Mr. Biden is in the strange position of having to deal with the situation at home with Donald Trump before he can be really confident about the changes he can make in the world. And he's, of course, started on the long round of calls with foreign counterparts, with all the obvious Western allies being at the top of the list. So they have included a Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, on Monday, and then the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, the French President, Emmanuel Macron, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, and the Irish Prime Minister, Michael Martin. Now, Mr. Biden makes much of his Irish roots. And so I thought the Irish might be the first in line, but he's certainly going to be pushing for the peace to be maintained on the island of Ireland after Brexit. And Mr. Biden's foreign policy slogan appears to be "America is back," which will be a change following Trump's vaguely threatening "Make America Great Again." And in this sense, I think Biden's main aim will be to try and turn America back into a respectable world player again. That said, I think...
Sorry, Nabila, I was just going to bring in Nigel and just expand on what you've just said there about people like Justin Trudeau getting the first phone calls, and European leaders and Boris Johnson, the Irish leader. I imagine, Nigel, that leaders who had a difficult relationship with President Trump, like Merkel and Trudeau, are going to be very happy to see what Biden in the White House.
Yes, indeed. That they are very relieved that he's won the election. We've swapped a petulant, irascible and unpredictable president for a rational one, and that's really important on the world stage. Now, other leaders who might be quite pleased with this are President Xi in China. He won't get hit suddenly with a load of tariffs he's not expecting. I'd imagine Rouhani in Iran will be quite happy. It looks as if the deal will, the nuclear deal will be back on, which means sanctions being lifted. Netanyahu in Israel, not so happy, although Biden is a great Israeli supporter. He's opposed to illegal Israeli settlements on the West Bank. And of course, bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Biden has said that he wants to see the end of the war in Yemen. And of course, it will end, provided America and Britain don't keep sending arms to Saudi Arabia.
Just very quickly, before we move on to the next story, Nabila, we remember that Trump's first foreign visit as president was to Saudi Arabia. Where do you think Biden might make his first foreign trip to?
Well, it's very difficult to call, really, but I think one aspect that we mustn't forget about American foreign policy is that it has had a very controversial side to it for many years. And even so-called presidents, liberal presidents like Obama, had a notorious reputation for bombing other countries, for example. Obama was certainly more interested in prosecuting wars than Trump, who had a far more isolationist view. And Obama's often ferocious foreign policy was prosecuted while Biden was, of course, his vice president. And Biden also championed the Iraq War in 2002 when he chaired the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and he had a massive influence on supporting President Bush's resolution to invade Iraq. So I think we can expect plenty of hawkish policy from Biden.
Well, let's look at some other policies that he might be looking at. The future American president has promised to return to the Paris Agreement. And Nigel, this seems to be one of the main things on his to-do list.
Yes, I think that climate change is right at the top of his agenda. And he's got a big job in his hands. And he's talking about net zero emissions in America by 2050, that electricity production will be carbon-free by 2035, and he's prepared to put big bucks into it. He wants to spend $2 trillion on making energy-efficient buildings, 4 million of them. He's talking about transport being electric, banning fracking on public land. So there's a lot to do in those 4 years that he's got.
Yeah, and Nabila, this is one of the things he spoke to President Macron about, and he's been invited to the COP26 conference here in the UK next year. Is he going to push other world leaders to do more, do you think?
Well, I think one has to contrast, what Biden will stand for compared to his predecessor, Donald Trump. And it has to be said that one of the greatest shocks for everybody during the Trump administration was Donald Trump, pulling America out of the Paris climate change agreement. And this was, of course, the landmark 2015 deal, which aimed to limit global warming well below the 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial temperatures. But in June 2017, Trump announced that the US, the world's second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, would withdraw from the agreement. Now, Trump's decision to pull out of the landmark accord was the first major step in his campaign to systematically roll back federal climate policies set up during the Obama administration. And Trump has since reversed dozens of climate-related regulations, including rules on air pollution, emissions, drilling, and oil and gas extractions. And Biden is now expected to get the USA back on track with the rest of the civilized world in fighting global warming. And China...
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I was going to say, it'd be interesting to see what direction he takes it in, because he's certainly committed to improving global warming standards. Let's move on to Hong Kong. So here we're seeing the mass resignation of Hong Kong opposition lawmakers. Nigel, just talk us through this. Why are they resigning en masse?
Well, they're resigning because 4 opposition members were turfed out. Now, these are pro-democracy members. So the others resigned in protest of this happening, which means that all 19 pro-democracy members in the legislature have now gone. What we don't know is whether the chief executive there, Carrie Lam, was asking Beijing to help her do this, or whether she's doing Beijing's bidding. Either way, it's bad news for Hong Kong. When Britain pulled out in 1997, the deal was that it would be one country with 2 systems, and the system that worked in Hong Kong was going to be free speech up until 2047. And it looks like China is breaking that deal, hence the anger of our own UK Foreign Secretary and the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten.
Yeah, so this is a China resolution saying that anyone who doesn't seem to be patriotic or recognise China's sovereignty over Hong Kong can get booted out of the legislature. Nabila, doesn't this fly in the face of the one country, 2 systems protocol?
Well, it is an utterly disgraceful attack on democracy in Hong Kong by Beijing, but it's by no means a surprising one. And Hong Kong has been in turmoil for a long time now, and the Chinese communists effectively want to wipe out any form of opposition. And these MPs are protesting against this as Nigel said, the disqualification of 4 colleagues after China effectively bypassed due process to get rid of them. And it has to be noted that coronavirus has been very useful to the Chinese in halting pro-democracy street protests, and security has also been stepped up enormously. Now, it appears that a legitimate parliamentary opposition to Beijing is being wiped out too, and this will have very sinister implications for the future of Hong Kong. And other countries, including Britain, have voiced a severe opposition to what is going on, but you get the impression that the Chinese don't really care.
Yeah, you do get that impression. You mentioned coronavirus. Our last story is linked to that, with universities trying to oversee a mass student exodus for Christmas, all these students wanting to go home. This is something they're talking about in the UK. I imagine it's a similar issue all around the world. Nigel, an evacuation operation that's going to be carried out from the beginning of December. Tell us more about this story.
Yes, indeed. And I think that Britain's 1 million students have had a really rough time of it since they went back to university for the autumn term. That effectively they've been locked up since they got there. They've had to deal with an awful lot of coronavirus amongst them. Now the plan is to lift their spirits by getting them home for Christmas. And the only way we can do that is for them to be mass tested and rapid testing with results in 15 minutes when the UK ends its lockdown on December the 3rd. The idea then is any who test positive will have to quarantine for 14 days, and then they should be able to get home by Christmas. But as I say, they've had a really rough time of it since they've gone back, and it's going to be a logistical nightmare actually making sure that this works. And the UK has not been terribly good about organising things.
Yeah, and I think you're right. You hit the nail on the head. When students go to university, they expect to have a great time and at least have face-to-face teaching and be able to be in communal areas and meet with other students. Nabila, students have pretty much had an awful time because of coronavirus.
Well, yes, indeed. But I think this U-turn by the British government will be seen by many students as good news. Remember, back in September, Health Secretary Matt Hancock suggested that students may have to remain on their campuses over Christmas and effectively miss out on seeing their families. Now, there will be an evacuation-style operation in December, and also plans to offer as many rapid coronavirus tests to students as possible so they can travel more safely. But the government hopes that the travel window coming after lockdown will mean that there is less risk of students transmitting the virus to friends and families back home. But despite all the rigorous planning, I think there's no doubt that the universities really are coronavirus hotbeds, and an estimated 40,000 students have contracted the virus while in university this term, while thousands more are forced to self-isolate.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a very different Christmas for a lot of people this year. Guys, thank you very much indeed for joining us, Nigel Nelson and Nabila Ramdani, on this edition of Behind the Headlines.